This is one animal that somehow became all of this. Luxury steaks, billion-dollar burgers, barbecue people wait hours to eat, street food loved around the world. The strange part? None of these foods are trying to be the same thing. A ribeye doesn't taste like brisket. Brisket doesn't taste like filet mignon. Yet they all come from exactly the same animal. So what creates the difference? The answer is hidden inside the cow itself. Because every major cut tells a different story. And once you understand those stories, you'll never look at beef the same way again. The secret behind beef is surprisingly simple. Movement. Some muscles work constantly. Others barely work at all. And that changes everything. Tenderness, texture, flavor, even price. Hard-working muscles become tougher. Less active muscles stay tender. But here's the twist. Tender doesn't automatically mean better. Some of the toughest cuts create some of the most beloved meals on earth. Every cut represents a different balance between tenderness, flavor, fat, and cooking time. And that's what makes beef so fascinating. The journey begins at the shoulder, the chuck. If beef has an unsung hero, this is probably it. The shoulder works hard every day. That creates strength, but it also creates toughness, which is why chuck rarely receives the attention given to expensive steaks. Yet for generations, this cut quietly fed millions of people. Because people discovered something important. Tough doesn't mean bad, it means potential. Cook chuck slowly and everything changes. The connective tissue breaks down. Collagen turns into gelatin. The meat softens. The flavor deepens. This is the cut behind countless pot roasts and family meals. It's also one of the biggest sources of ground beef, which means countless burgers begin right here. Not luxurious, not glamorous, just dependable. And sometimes the foods people remember most aren't the expensive ones. They're the ones that always showed up when it mattered. Walk into almost any serious steakhouse and you'll notice a pattern. One steak seems to appear everywhere. More often than not, it's a ribeye. And that popularity didn't happen by accident. The rib muscles don't work very hard, which helps them remain naturally tender. But tenderness alone didn't make ribeye famous. Marbling did. Those thin white streaks inside the meat are intramuscular fat. And marbling is one of the biggest drivers of richness, juiciness, and perceived flavor. As the steak cooks, that fat melts into the meat. The result is a steak that balances tenderness and flavor remarkably well. That's why so many chefs and steak lovers consider ribeye the benchmark. Not the most expensive steak, not the most tender, just one of the best combinations of flavor and texture available. A great ribeye can make an entire table go quiet. And that's usually a good sign. Now we arrive at one of the biggest debates in food. Filet mignon, or New York strip. Filet mignon comes from the tenderloin, a muscle that does very little work throughout the animal's life. As a result, it becomes exceptionally tender. The texture is so soft that many people describe it as butter-like. For some diners, that's the ultimate luxury. But many experienced steak lovers eventually choose something else. The New York strip. Not because it's more tender, because many people prefer its stronger beef flavor. The strip offers more texture, more chew, more intensity, and suddenly the conversation changes. The question is no longer, which steak is more expensive? Now the question becomes, what do you value most, ultimate tenderness or deeper flavor? That's why both cuts have remained steakhouse classics for decades. One represents elegance, the other represents intensity, and neither side ever truly wins the argument. And this is where the world of beef starts getting strange. Because eventually, someone looked at a beautifully marbled steak and asked, what if there was more? Not a little more, a lot more. The answer became Wagyu. The first time most people see high-grade Wagyu, it barely looks real. Thin veins of fat run through nearly every part of the meat. the line between muscle and marbling begins to blur. And that's exactly what made Wagyu famous. Because marbling changes how beef feels, how it tastes, how it melts. As the beef cooks, the intramuscular fat softens and spreads through the meat. The texture becomes incredibly rich, almost silky. That's why high-grade Japanese Wagyu is often served in smaller portions. A few slices can feel richer than a much larger portion of conventional steak. And that's what makes Wagyu fascinating. It's not simply expensive beef. It's the result of genetics, breeding, feeding practices, and decades of refinement. Some people try it and instantly understand the hype. Others find it too rich, and somehow that disagreement only makes the legend bigger. If Wagyu represents luxury, brisket represents patience. Because brisket should not be this famous, at least not on paper. The cut comes from the chest, a hard-working muscle that supports much of the animal's weight throughout its life. It's naturally tough, dense, filled with connective tissue. For years, it wasn't considered one of the most desirable cuts on the animal. Then barbecue changed everything, because pitmasters discovered something remarkable. The tougher the cut, the greater the transformation. If you're willing to wait. Somewhere in Texas, while most people are asleep, someone is tending a smoker, checking temperatures, adding wood, watching smoke drift into the darkness. Because brisket operates on its own schedule. 12 hours, 14 hours, sometimes longer. Then the magic begins. Collagen turns into gelatin. Fat slowly renders. The meat becomes tender enough to pull apart with almost no effort. That's why people line up outside famous barbecue restaurants before sunrise. Brisket is one of barbecue's most dramatic transformations, proof that some of the world's greatest foods began as problems waiting to be solved. Hidden beneath some of beef's biggest stars sits a cut chefs absolutely love. Short ribs. Raw, they don't look particularly impressive. They're thick, heavy, almost intimidating. But experienced cooks see potential because very few cuts transform as dramatically as short ribs. Give them time and everything changes. The meat softens. The connective tissue breaks down. The flavor concentrates. What begins as a tough muscle becomes rich enough to feel luxurious. And what's remarkable is how many cultures discovered this independently. In France, short ribs are slowly braised. In Korea, galbi became one of the country's most beloved barbecue dishes. In the United States, short ribs became favorites in barbecue and restaurants alike. Different countries, different techniques, same discovery. This cut rewards patience. Not every legendary cut lives in a steakhouse. Some live on crowded streets, beside hot grills, surrounded by smoke and conversation. That's where flank and skirt steak belong. These muscles work hard, which means they're leaner and less tender than premium steak cuts. But they offer something else, flavor, lots of it. That's why they're used in dishes like fajitas and carne asada. The secret isn't cooking them for hours. It's the opposite. High heat, quick cooking, careful slicing, especially across the grain. Done correctly, these cuts deliver an intensity of beef flavor that feels much larger than their price tag suggests. Sometimes the most memorable bite comes wrapped in a tortilla, instead of sitting on fine china. Near the back of the animal, we find two cuts that quietly support millions of meals every year: sirloin and round. They rarely appear on luxury tasting menus, but they've never needed to. Sirloin became popular because it offers balance, good flavor, good tenderness, good value. Round became popular because it's practical, lean, versatile, reliable. These are the cuts behind countless weeknight dinners, roast beef sandwiches, and family meals. And food culture isn't built entirely on special occasions. Most of it is built on meals like these. The remarkable thing about beef isn't that one cut costs more than another. It's that humans looked at the same animal and somehow created completely different worlds. A Texas brisket smoked through the night. High-grade Wagyu served in carefully measured portions. Korean galbis shared around a grill. A burger eaten during a lunch break. A family roast served on a Sunday afternoon. Different countries, different traditions, different histories, yet every one of them begins in exactly the same place. One animal. That's what makes food so fascinating. It turns biology into culture, ingredients into traditions, meals into memories. Because years from now, most people won't remember the exact cut they ate. They'll remember the people they shared it with. And that's the real story of beef. Not just the meat itself, but the moments built around it. And once you see that, you're no longer looking at different cuts of beef. You're looking at different chapters of the same story.